I'm going to start a series of doing my makeup over my own scary childhood stories. Up until I was about 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic fields, so I used to see a lot of stuff and experience a lot of different dimensions. The first story starts when I was 2. I don't remember it much, but my parents have told me this multiple times. We lived in this little white house. It was very old. My parents used to always hear me laughing and playing in my room with someone, but there was no one in my room. When they asked who I was talking to, I told them it was a little boy named Omar. They thought it was just an imaginary friend, but now that I think back on it, when I was 3 and 4, I did see someone. He was always very kind to me. I would play Barbies and he would play with me. He would draw me pictures. I would leave my books out for him so he could read while I was at preschool. I would tell him about my days and he would tell me about his. But things started to get really weird once my brother was born, and that is when my parents started to see him too. They believe that this is because he wanted to be the only little boy in the house. Stay tuned for part 2. Here is part 2 of the series of the little boy. If you haven't seen part 1, go watch that first because it won't make sense if you don't watch that. Up until I was 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic fields, so I used to see a lot of things. When my brother was born, my parents used to sense and see the little boy as well. My mom used to feel his energy sitting in the rocking chair. My brother's mechanical toys used to just start making noise. He started to show up less and less in my room, and every time he would, he kind of scared me. He wasn't himself anymore. He was mad, angry, everything. My parents believe it's just because he wanted to be seen and he was lonely, and now that I had a little brother, I wasn't paying as much attention to the little boy. My mom would wake up to my brother crying in the middle of the night and go check on him, and she would sense something standing next to her. Weeks later, we moved out of that house due to a shooting in our backyard. My old nanny, who lived across the street, told us after we moved out, she would always see something in the window of my room. To this day, Omar still shows up in my dreams. Continuing my series on my scary childhood stories. Up until I was 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic fields, so I used to see a lot of things. After my dad remarried, we moved into a blue house, and me and my stepsister shared a room. Right when we moved in, I already knew something was off about that house. It was just kind of creepy. I got weird vibes from it. Nothing really happened within the first couple months of living there until winter hit. Keep in mind, this was like during when I was 14 and 15. Me and my stepsister's room was right below the attic, and at night we used to hear footsteps up there. These weren't footsteps coming from an animal, they were more footsteps coming from heavy boots hitting the ground. I told my dad about it, and so he had an exterminator come over and check it out. When the exterminator came, he found no animals up there and no holes in which animals could get through. But that didn't stop the footsteps every single night. My dad didn't want me and my sister going up there, so one day when he was gone, we went up there by ourselves and found some really creepy things. Stay tuned for part 2 tomorrow. Here is part 2 of doing my makeup over my own scary childhood stories. This is part 2 of the attic series. Up until I was 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic field, so I used to see a lot of things. After the exterminator came and found no animals or places where animals could get into, me and my stepsister decided to go up into the attic after my dad had left. When we went up there, it was filthy. The first thing that we noticed were hangers, and they were hanging clothes and belts from the ceiling. The weird thing is the clothing didn't look that gross, and it looked like it hadn't been up there for very long. The energy up there just felt very intense, and we wanted to get out of there right away. The footsteps didn't stop after the exterminator came or after we went up there. We believe after we went up there, we made the spirit angry because weird things started to happen. The lights in the hallway used to turn on and off all the time, even though no one was upstairs because my parents lived downstairs. There'd be footsteps in the hallway, and when we would check, no one would be there. I can't fit everything in 60 seconds, so stay tuned for part 3. This is part 3 of the attic series. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2, go watch those first. Up until I was 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic field, so I used to see a lot of things. As I stated in part 2, after we went up into the attic, we think we made the spirit very mad. For instance, one night around 2 o'clock, my brother's door slammed, take for granted he wasn't home, and then all of the lights in the entire upstairs turned off all at once. A couple seconds later, we heard this old man say hello outside of our door. We started screaming at the top of our lungs, and my dad came upstairs. He turned all the lights back on for us, and once he went back downstairs, the lights turned back off. We also used to sneak out of our windows a lot and leave them open, so when we got back, we could just climb right through, but when we come back, they would be shut. Our beds were pretty much right next to each other. There was just a little walkway in between, and if one of us would wake up in the middle of the night, we could feel a presence standing over us. The footsteps in the attic also never stopped. Comment if you want to hear more scary stories. Doing my makeup over my own scary childhood stories. Up until I was 16, I didn't know how to put a barrier up on my own energetic fields, so I used to see a lot of things. This story is why you should never mess with the Ouija boards. We moved into my dad's girlfriend's house where one of her daughters lived upstairs, my brother lived upstairs, her other daughter lived down in the basement, along with me who lived in a makeshift room in the basement. One night, me and her two daughters decided to buy an Ouija board. After my dad and his girlfriend went to bed, me and her daughters all went downstairs, grabbed a bunch of candles, set up the Ouija board, and grabbed a bunch of our great-grandparents' stuff. We wanted to see if any of our great-grandparents would talk to us. We were so excited because the Ouija board was working and things were moving it. We asked what the spirit's name was, expecting it to be one of our great-grandparents, but it said its name was Tick. T-I-C. We asked it to repeat it again, and it spelled out T-I-C. We knew that it wasn't one of our great-grandparents. Stay tuned for part 2. This is part 2 of why you should never do an Ouija board. Disclaimer, please only use an Ouija board if you know what you're doing and if you're trained on doing it. So after it said its name was Tick, we asked how old it was. The spirit responded with 9 years old. We asked what gender it was. There was no response. We knew for sure at this point we were not talking to one of our great-grandparents. I wanted to stop right then and there. I was really freaked out and I knew that we weren't talking to something good, but my older stepsister wanted to keep going. So out of peer pressure, of course, I kept going. She asked if it was human. Its response was no. We asked if we were safe. The spirit said yes, but I really didn't feel safe. We asked if the spirit was stuck in the house. The response was yes. The next thing my older stepsister asked, which I really wish she didn't, is if Tick was the only one there with us. The response was no. 60 seconds is not enough time for this story, and the story is really long, so stay tuned for part 3. This is part 3 to the Ouija board story, and why you should never use an Ouija board. So my older stepsister asked if Tick was the only one there with us. The answer was no. She then asked how many spirits were there with us. There was no response. She asked if all the spirits there with us were good spirits. The Ouija board said no. Right as we asked that, the bathroom was right behind us and we heard a huge loud slam in the bathroom. All of us were really freaked out just sitting there not knowing what to do. The candles started flickering. There was so much tension in the room. I have never felt anything like it. That is when my other stepsister screamed at the top of her lungs and told me to move. She saw a black hand approaching from behind me and was going to grab my face. Because she screamed so loud, my dad woke up and we heard him, so we said goodbye really quickly. I went upstairs really quick to calm my dad down and say everything was fine. But after that night, we awoke something and a lot more things happened. Stay tuned for part 4. This is part 4 of my childhood story about the Ouija board. Kids, please never use an Ouija board. Just stay away from it. So after we used the Ouija board, we definitely awoke something in the house. The energy downstairs was so intense that none of us could sleep down there. Because of this, me and my older stepsister slept upstairs for literally weeks. Remember the shadow of the hand that wrapped around my face in part 3? Well, that hand didn't disappear. My stepmom said she saw it multiple times when she would go downstairs and change the laundry. It got to the point where her and my dad didn't even want to go downstairs. The cat would chase things that weren't even there. Doors would slam. Floorboards would creak at night. My dad would constantly see my cat chasing a figure, and all you could see was the figure's spine. It would run on all fours. The hauntings got so bad that my dad decided that we needed to move out. Ever since then, nobody has lived in that house for longer than 2 months.
Storytime on how I found out my dad was transgender. Also, by the way, at the time I was 12. So I grew up an only child. I always wanted siblings, but my parents said that I was enough. And we would never really go see family like my grandparents. When I was a toddler, I used to see them. Well, at least that's what my parents told me. But I was never close with any of my family besides my one aunt. So one day I had a sleepover and I invited my friend and we played hide and seek. And I spent like 10 minutes looking for her until I finally found her in my basement holding a book. I was like, girl, I'm done playing with you. And she said she found an old picture book. When she told me, I was kind of excited because I haven't seen much of my family. As we went through the book, I saw a picture of my grandparents and 2 little girls. One of the girls in the picture I knew was my aunt because of the mole, but I didn't know who the other girl was. I flipped the picture around and it said familia, which by the way is family in Spanish. And I was like, so there's another aunt that I don't know about? But if you want to know how I confronted my dad about it, come back for part 2. This is part 2 on how I found out my dad was transgender. So, like I said, I found a picture of my dad's family, but he wasn't in it. That night, I went to my parents' bedroom and I saw my mom. I showed her the picture and she gasped. I asked, do I have another aunt and where's dad? She told me to sit down and that they wanted to tell her, but they wanted to wait at an age where they think I'd understand. So, a couple minutes later, my dad walked in and I asked, who's this girl? He sat next to me, held my shoulders and said that was him. And I started laughing at first because I was like, you're not a little girl. And he responded, at that time, that was me. And from there, he just told me everything. To when he finally transitioned, he talked about how unaccepting my grandparents were, which is partially why I really don't go see them. After everything my dad told me, I just sat there and cried for him. And my mom and dad both held me and told me everything was going to be fine. It's been 9 years and I have so much more respect for my dad, no matter what anyone thinks.